Welcome to another video. Tonight we have 8 stories. From stories of empty subway cars, creepy neighbors, a tale from a security guard, and more. If you have a story of your own, it can be sent to reddit.com/r/slumberreads. I promise I don't get sent as many stories as you might think, so if you send one in, there's a good chance it'll end up in a video. These videos do take me quite a bit of time to create, so if you're feeling generous, and if you feel this video is worth one, please be sure to drop a like rating. Subscribing if you're new is also greatly appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I'm posting this using a VPN and whatever additional security precautions I can take to avoid being found. I'm posting this here so authorities have the grounds to doubt my story's authenticity. So my story isn't immediately litigious. But for the people, please listen to me. I wouldn't wish what happened to me on my worst enemy. I will never be able to see the world the same way, and I will probably never get an explanation for what happened. If I do, it will more than likely result in my death. Like in a comfortable ignorance. I am not telling you this to poison you. I am telling you this so you can avoid confirming it for yourself. Treat this story like Schrodinger's cat. As long as you avoid any possible experience in which you may have to confront the reality I have, your comfortable existence will never be threatened. I rely pretty heavily on the MTA. The subway station in New York City for those who are unfamiliar. I use it every day to get to work, to get home, to meet Tinder dates at restaurants, to go to friends' apartments. Before the pandemic, MTA cars in Manhattan were usually at least half full, sometimes even so full during the day, you were standing with your back and front pressed up against someone else's elbow or backpack. Once the pandemic hit, the number of subway cars dwindled, but the cars were still always sparsely packed, a heavy air of gloom hanging in the 6-foot spaces between masked riders. As vaccination rates have been going up and infection rates have been going down, the subway cars are getting fuller again. In my 6 years living in Manhattan, I'm not sure if I've ever been alone on a subway car. It drives me crazy to look back on now. I'm sure it must have happened at some point, but almost all of my memories in the subway are marked by the presence of other people, the bizarre interactions with strangers, the avoidance of the belligerently drunk, the search to find a seat in a packed car. It's hard to believe this has never happened, but I have no way of proving that it has. A week ago on Saturday, I was coming back from a friend's place. I was a bit tipsy, I'll confess, but nowhere near drunk enough to misremember any of what happened. It was around 3 a.m. Late, but not late enough for the entirety of Manhattan to be in bed. I had taken drunken train rides home from bars and parties plenty of times around the same hour and was usually surrounded by people doing the same thing. I was waiting for the Q train. I was at 49th and needed to go to 8th. It was only 6 stops. There was a good handful of people on the platform. A disheveled man sitting on a bench surrounded by stained bags. A clearly intoxicated couple lovingly swaying together. Some other folks I don't remember. I walked down to a part of the platform where there was no one else waiting, just as COVID protocol. I was still near people, but they were far enough that they'd probably be taking their own cars. I was tired, heavy-lidded, and I leaned against a pole while I waited. The subway came in about 5 minutes, and I waited for a second as the door slid open in case anyone needed to get out. Upon walking in, I noticed the car was completely empty. Like I said, I can't confirm I've never been on an empty subway car. I can't even confirm the emptiness was the cause of what happened. My very human brain is just begging for some rational explanation, some conclusion to draw. It's the best I can do. I was surprised by how eerie the empty car felt. The fluorescent lights reflected off the plastic seats, highlighting miscellaneous stains and patches. The automated voice announcing the closing of the doors ricocheted off the walls with no low chattering to muffle it. I sat in the middle of the car, leaned my head back, and closed my eyes. Only for a second. I'd done it before. I had the incredibly useful and maybe explicitly New Yorker talent of being able to exist in the liminal space of sleep and still listen for my stop. Or I thought I did. When I heard 8th Street, I thought it seemed strange. I didn't feel like I'd fully drifted into sleep, but I also didn't feel like the train had already made it through 5 stops. I didn't hear any of them announced, and I could have sworn I hadn't had my eyes closed for more than a minute. But I chalked it up to being drunker than I'd thought. I opened my eyes expecting at least a couple more people in the car, having accumulated throughout the stops, but it was still empty. At this point, I couldn't think much of it. It was creepy, but so was 3 a.m. in general. My mom used to tell me nothing good happens between 3 and 4 a.m. The well-documented witching hour. I just wanted to get back to my apartment. I got off the car, expecting to see a few people get off the other cars and a few people waiting on the platform. Nothing. It was completely empty. Okay, I thought. Maybe the city does sleep. But then as I started towards the exit, I looked into the other cars out of habit. Completely empty. The cars I'd seen people getting into, I guess they got off, I reasoned. 8th Street was usually a pretty busy stop. It was near NYU and Lower East Side, attracting a much younger and more energetic crowd, and there were almost always people buzzing around at any hour. But again, I chalked it up to coincidence and walked out to the exit, through the turnstile and up the stairs. I spilled out to the street looking down at my phone, and it wasn't until I looked up that my heart stopped all at once, and then crawled up into my throat and started throbbing so fast I was sure I would die right then and there. I struggled with pretty bad anxiety for a good portion of my life, and that usually came along with episodes of intense dissociation. I read once a good grounding technique was to confirm to yourself that you're not in a dream. To do this, you could pinch the skin between your thumb and forefinger. If your fingers went right through the skin, it meant you were dreaming, and if the skin was real and tangible, you were awake. I quickly reached to pinch my skin, shaking with fear, knowing in my heart my hand would feel as solid as it always did. And of course it did. The city was recognizable in that nauseating way the weirdly familiar photos of empty grocery stores and movie theater lobbies are. The sidewalks were still organized in grids, and the encroaching plethora of skyscrapers and vague storefronts still marked the skyline, but everything was built in ways I couldn't quite comprehend. The skyscrapers twisted and curved like knotty trees, in ways that seemed architecturally impossible. And they were dilapidated, empty stores with broken windows sitting directly next to glowing, monolithic buildings that looked newly built. The sky was cloaked in a brothy, muddy gray smog that was no doubt impenetrable by sunlight. It was so low it obscured the top halves of skyscrapers. I could see columns of thick white smoke funneling into the air in multiple places, coming from nondescript buildings. It was impossibly warm, the kind of smoggy warmth that sticks to your skin and bloats your lungs. I couldn't differentiate from night or day. The only light was that of the functioning storefronts, light that almost made me feel epileptic. Some storefronts played quick, looping video clips. Some had flashing neon lights that were so bright they didn't feel appropriate for human eyes. Some were entirely shrouded in what looked like floor-length computer screens that featured hyper-realistic graphics of scantily clad women beckoning in passerby, or a spinning wheel of the products the stores presumably sold. And there were passersby. That was the worst part. The city was still alive. The streets were thickly lined with tents, cardboard boxes, propped-up sheets, overstuffed shopping carts, and cramped sprawls of sleeping or stupefied humans. It was so condensed some of them were sleeping on the limbs of others, They were all deathly pale with bloodshot eyes, and many of them seemed to be covered in what can only be described as full-body cystic acne. It was only then I realized the constant gravelly sound I'd been barely processing the whole time. The sound of asphalt being crunched by tires was their coughs. They were coughing constantly, in between sentences, in their sleep. I noticed a few of them looking at me with dopey eyes, like they could barely understand the visual information their eyes were feeding them. Like visual overstimulation had regulated them to a state of near blindness. However, right next to these people walked seemingly upright and healthy people, many wearing suits and carrying briefcases. Their clothes didn't seem to move right, like they were made out of some stiff, impervious material that fought the movement of their bodies. It took me a couple seconds to realize they were all wearing masks and glasses. The masks weren't the N95s coronavirus had made widespread. They looked more like the plastic sheaths that feed into an oxygen tank, completely covering their faces from just below their eyes to under their chin. They all had tiny blinking lights on the sides. Most were green, a few were red, but besides the masks, they were also all wearing glasses. Just like in the New York City I was used to, the glasses came in all shapes and sizes. Some wore tiny horn-rimmed glasses. Others wore circular, tortoiseshell ones. But all of the lenses were tinted a cloudy gray, and all of the hinges featured the same pinprick lights on the masks. I noticed many of them looking at me as they walked by, but I was so overwhelmed by what I was seeing I wasn't yet able to feel threatened. The atmosphere was starting to affect me. My skin was prickling with sweat, but stinging in a strange way I wasn't accustomed to. My lungs were foggy and felt filled with fluid. My eyes were darting around, trying to avoid the blinding blue light of the storefronts. It was only then that my brain moved on from visual sensory overload to an olfactory one. The air smelled. I could swear it was 3 or 4 smells wrapped into one invisible braid, rotating in the air and releasing each scent individually for a minute or two before releasing the next. First, there was the mechanical smell of gasoline and a nearby fire. Then there was the acrid tang of hot garbage. Then there was the worst one, rotting meat. Maybe what I would imagine as the smell of sizzling flesh. The 3 smells shifted back and forth, churning my stomach. As the heat swallowed me and the smell singed my nasal passages, I turned back around to vomit when I was faced with what I still assumed would be the entry of the subway stop I'd come from. But the sign was no longer there. There was still the descending staircase, just as decrepit as before, but now there was a steel door frame positioned directly in front of the staircase with a battered sign hanging off the top. The sign read 21. There was a red light blinking underneath the numbers. Now I really started to panic, and lost in a haze of complete bewilderment, I just stood shock still watching the flurry of well-dressed people, many of whom looked at me with raised eyebrows. I saw a few of them pull out phones, which were still surprisingly recognizable, although many of them were so thin they were almost pliable like fabric and appeared to melt into the hands of the user. And their screens glowed so bright the light coming off of them almost looked like a white pillar. I then noticed that, although everyone was wearing similar glasses and masks and stiff-looking clothing, some people walked individually, while others seemed to be attached to people. It was mostly women attached to men. The man would walk in front and the woman follow closely behind, attached at the waist by this diaphanous, almost invisible band that would retract and tighten with ease. I tried to see how many people were attached to others, but the band was so thin and they walked so fast that I quickly gave up. It all felt like a car crash I couldn't look away from. I just stood there, dumbfounded for an amount of time I am unable to quantify. It could have been a minute. It could have been 10 hours. The light didn't change. The air didn't change, and the never-ending stream of almost identical people, that didn't stop. Neither did the perpetual throaty coughs of the people on the street. Finally, unsure of any other option, I turned back around to the staircase. It felt unnatural, and I almost expected to be immediately punished for doing so, but upon walking down, I saw the same turnstiles that were usually at the station entrance. Although now they seemed to be turned into some kind of exhibit. There was a plaque on one of them with a date and a small description of what a turnstile was. Next to the turnstiles, what was usually an emergency exit door with a push bar was now a giant plexiglass door that reached from ceiling to floor. Plain black lettering at the top read 21, and underneath it, small lettering that read $45,000. There was a blinding white screen next to it that looked reminiscent of a credit card reader or some kind of payment mechanism. I fumbled at it for a second before realizing it was a futile effort. I could barely see the screen, nor did I have whatever payment method it clearly needed. In accordance with many of the New York nights I had before everything changed, I didn't have train fare and would have to jump the turnstile. Arms trembling, so weak they could barely push me up, I popped myself up on the metal sides of the turnstile and prepared to push myself over. Where I would usually sail over the turnstiles and land on the other side, I hit some sort of invisible wall with an audible thud. Whatever I hit was freezing cold and launched me to the opposite side of the entrance. The wind was knocked out of me and my body landed hard on the gritty floor. As I struggled to catch my breath, I heard footsteps approaching. I was weak and sore and exhausted, and I couldn't look up to see who it was. I couldn't even be scared. I wasn't even sure I wanted to go back to whatever normal was, after knowing this existed and was somehow plausible at some point in mankind's progression. I just laid back and stared at the blinking fluorescent light on the ceiling, which was eventually obscured by the head of what appeared to be a businessman leering over me. The mask and glasses erased any semblance of humanity. He approached me just as cold and clinically as his appearance suggested. It was terrifying to be acknowledged by him, recognizing I was truly here, in this moment, perceptible. But now, here, with this man addressing me directly, I could no longer pretend I was some invisible soul trapped in a temporary nightmare. You're not supposed to be here. I'm sure you know that. I nodded weakly. He turned away and I could hear his footsteps retreat, brief shuffling and then return. He looked down at me holding up a comically oversized syringe. This hurts less than you'd think. It'll only last a second and then you're done. It's worse than ending up as an attachment. He paused for a second. Probably. Before I could ask what an attachment was, I felt a jolt of searing pain in my thigh so intense it made my muscles seize and spasm. Then, within a second, I woke up in a sticky pool of, ostensibly, my own blood. Are you okay? I craned my neck upward to see a wobbling, elderly woman positioned above me, eyebrows knitted with concern. Above her was a clear blue sky, and the very visible tops of tall, dimly lit buildings. The streets bustled with cars, but the sound of gravel crunching was only that of the tires. The air was cool and dry and breathable. I looked down and could see the pool of blood, blossoming outwards towards my hands in crimson rivulets on the sidewalk. I looked back up and the woman was still standing over me. That's a pretty big fall. She motioned at the building directly in front of me. I can't imagine you're coming from that. My legs were broken. I knew that immediately. Maybe paralyzed. I was supposed to be dead. I knew that too. I would have to go through the rest of my life knowing I am supposed to be dead. Could you call an ambulance? Was all I could muster. It's a week later, and although I am partially ambulatory with a wheelchair, my brain is permanently immobilized by the thought that I will come into contact with what I saw again at some point in the future, and even possibly have to live in it permanently. I'm not sure how long I'll be able to exist here, in the now. The few times I've left my apartment, I've caught glimpses of the well-dressed businessmen in their masks and glasses, following from a safe distance but quickly turning corners as soon as I look in their direction. I feel the suspicion from my friends. No one quite knows what happened, and my story has changed a few times due to the brain fog and general terror that have yet to lift. But I am terrified to tell them. I am terrified to tell anyone what happened, knowing it's possibly the businessmen may just be waiting for me to tell, knowing my entire future could be predicated on whether or not I cave to the unbearable weight of this one huge secret. Whether or not I actually want to live is something I'll have to come to terms with over the next few weeks. Found the suicide note they left in my apartment, in my handwriting, addressing certain close friends and close family members of mine by name. In my voice too, written the way I write, in a way that could only be emulated by someone incredibly intimate with me. Maybe only myself. If you were ever about to step in an empty subway car, turn around and never look back. Again, I can't promise the emptiness was the reason this happened, but it feels good to pretend I have some plausible handle on what happened. It feels good to pretend that there is a viable way for other, unpoisoned people to avoid the possibility of seeing what I saw. I can't promise you'll never go there, and I surely can't promise you'll make it back if you do. But I can promise you that there is something terrible out there, waiting for us, encroaching on us slowly. We don't even notice it. I can promise you hell is real, and it is made by man. If you have the ability, just walk home. I noticed it first on a Monday after an unusually brutal shift at work. Customers hounding me for refills, sauce on the side, extra napkins. You know how it is. That day was especially bad because I had one guy try the dollar bill trick on me. You know the one. He set out 5 ones and took away $1 every time I messed up or wasn't fast enough. I wasn't angry at him for taking any away. Only that he expected me to bend over backwards for $5 fucking dollars. Get real. After dealing with all of that, the last thing I wanted to see on my way to the front door was a creepy old man staring at me. He had been my duplex neighbor for over 5 years. Most people wouldn't live in a duplex for so long, but we only shared one wall with each other, and he was always very timid. The only sounds I heard through that wall were his low humming to jazz tunes and the clinking of pots as he cooked. This was his daily routine after spending hours in the garden talking to his flowers. He was a little off, sure, but he was very sweet. He respected my privacy and never approached me aside from the occasional, "Hello." Things changed a lot when his grandson moved in. Of the few conversations we had, he had not once mentioned a family. That's why I thought it was strange to see a chalky, scruffy 20-something man dragging a suitcase into the unit beside me on a warm Wednesday afternoon. I didn't ask who he was, but when he saw me reclining on my patio chair, he perked up with a, "Oh, you must be my new neighbor. My name's Cameron." He told me all about how much he missed his grandfather after so many years and how he was too elderly to be living alone. Something about him seemed off. I can't describe it, but it wasn't my business, so I brushed it off. Suddenly I was seeing more and more of Cameron, and less of my elderly neighbor. He was no longer spending time in the garden. I could no longer hear the faint jazz through the walls. Instead, I heard whirring of tools every night until 11 p.m. like a late-night remodel was happening next door. Honestly, it was so faint it never bothered me. At one point, those noises stopped too, and that's when I saw my elderly neighbor again. I stepped out of my car one day and began walking towards my front door when I caught something in the corner of my eye. The sunlight was hitting my neighbor's window at the perfect angle where I could hardly see anything but bright, flooding yellow. I squinted hard to make out the shape. All I could see was a figure standing behind the window, perfectly still. I decided not to dwell on it too much and went inside. but something about that sent a chill down my spine and lingered in my thoughts. As I lay in bed, I still couldn't forget about it. The next day, I glanced over at my neighbor's window, but the curtains were drawn. Well, maybe it was my imagination, so I went off to work like usual. Once I came home, he was standing there, staring, waiting behind his large glass window. His loose, draping skin accentuated by the fact that he was completely nude. He stared at me with hazy eyes and a sick expression on his face. It made me gag. I knew he was standing there for me. I had been coming home at the same time every day for years. I remained frozen, unsure if I should head inside or get in my car and drive somewhere far away. In the end, I decided I may have been overreacting. Cameron had told me a few days prior that the old man was suffering from dementia, which worsened every day. I didn't want to do anything rash, especially since my sweet neighbor was sick. He probably wasn't standing there on purpose. I decided to let it go. But days turned into weeks and the old man was waiting by the window every day. Even when I changed shift, he was always there waiting. Sometimes he was sitting on his satin chair with a cup of tea. But certain things remained the same, such as his naked, forever drooping skin and his hazy expression. Sometimes it felt like he grinned at me as I walked by. Nights felt uncomfortably cold as his loud breathing echoed through our shared wall. It felt as if he was always watching, even when he wasn't by the window. I never saw him come out of the house. I don't know if he ever left. Only Cameron would leave occasionally to gather groceries and come home whistling tunes on his way in. I tried to avoid looking at the old man as much as possible, but I noticed how sickly he became. Once, I leered a little longer near my door to see if he would turn to watch me leave. That day he was just standing there, unmoving, his skin drooping almost to the floor. I don't know why I knocked on his door. I don't know if I was worried about him or fed up. I just knew I couldn't take much more of the staring. It was driving me crazy. It only took 2 knocks before Cameron opened the door. "Hey, Rye, what can I help you with?" He said nonchalantly. Rye. Only my friends call me Rye. Who does this guy think he is calling me by that when we've only exchanged a couple sentences to each other? That really irritated me and I became a little more aggressive. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." I was unwilling to hide the agitation in my voice. He whistled. "Now really isn't the time. Can I invite you over for dinner later?" "No, we need to talk now." I was beginning to push my way in when I stopped. I saw something in my peripheral that made my stomach turn. I looked up at Cameron, my fearful expression crystal clear in his dilated pupils. His breathing became heavy. He looked excited. He reached out to grab me, but I was too fast. I ran into my unit and tightly locked the door. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. Thump, thump, thump. Cameron was hitting hard against our shared wall. "Come back. Let's have dinner." His muffled voice somehow carried into my living room. I tried to keep my composure so I could describe to the 911 operator exactly what I saw at my neighbor's house. Once they confirmed me police would arrive in 15 minutes, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and huddled into a corner of my living room. Cameron was still pounding against the wall, repeating the same 5 words. After about 10 minutes, he stopped. Silence. Then I heard the creaking of the neighbor's back door. It's funny how many small sounds you can make out when your senses are in survival mode. I sat praying that he wouldn't try to come into my home. It was dark now and the silence had filled with the chirping of crickets. My prayers were answered when I saw glaring red and blue lights approaching our driveway. Loud knocking nearly made me jump out of my skin. I slowly approached the window and let out a sigh of relief when I saw the cop standing there. I cautiously opened the door. "Ma'am, you called about some suspicious activity next door?" "My neighbor's skin," I whispered. The fear had managed to take my voice away to where I could barely speak. "What?" The policemen looked at each other in confusion. I pointed at the window attached to my neighbor's unit. Unlike other nights, the curtains were wide open and the silhouette of the old man's draping body stood behind the window. The police scurried over to the neighbor's unit and disappeared behind the door. I watched from the other side of the window as one of the policemen turned my elderly neighbor around. From my view, I could see all the stitching on his back. A poorly sewn-on zipper adorned the center, so that his skin could be worn like a sick, repulsive costume. I couldn't take it anymore. I let out all the vomit I had been holding back up to this point. The police didn't seem too pleased with their discovery either. Cameron, if that even was his real name, was never caught. I described him to the police, but his face was the type that didn't stand out at all. If I were to try to pick him out of a crowd, I'm not confident I could. He wasn't my neighbor's grandson, obviously. Sadly, my neighbor didn't have a family, but he seemed happy by himself up until, I had seen the old man a few times after Cameron moved in, but he was acting strange. I wish I had paid attention back then. I don't blame myself, but I do feel regret for the way things turned out. One thing's for sure, though. I'm never living so close to a neighbor again. I had just gone through a pretty rough divorce a few months ago. For the brief 2 years my ex and I were married, most of our nights ended up turning into shouting matches and insults. We were always so loud we had gotten several noise complaints and an eventual ultimatum that we could be thrown out of the building. Anyway, we ended the whole thing and she got the most of everything. The house belonged to her family, along with most of everything in it. She let me only have my clothes, some photos, and my dog Riley. I was short on money at the time. Luckily, a friend of mine let me stay in his home for as long as I needed. Well, I was looking for a better paying job to help me get my life back on track. My search led me to an opening for a campus security guard at the local community college. I arrived at the interview to learn that this was a job for the night shift. I wasn't too sure about taking the job at first, but my bills and growing debts weren't going to pay off themselves. Needless to say, I started the next night. The campus itself was a decent size, both in terms of area and the number of students. The core campus includes 14 educational and auxiliary buildings. The security office was by the south entrance of the college, situated on the second floor of the parking garage. The two senior security guards, James and Darnell, walked me through my job description. My task every night was to complete 2 full searches around campus, checking all the buildings and monitoring the security cameras. My shift would start at 9:30 at night and go through 6 o'clock in the morning, by which time I'd take the bus home. The job itself wasn't too bad. I kind of developed a friendship between James and Darnell, since there was a brief period of time our shifts would overlap. By the time they both left, it would be midnight for me, and I'd be alone on campus. It's so surreal how such a place that's bustling and full of students can quickly empty out and turn silent. When my shift starts, there's usually a few cars left in the lot for those who took evening classes. Some instructors and other staff would sometimes work extra late, but those instances were rare. In short, my interaction with other people besides my coworkers was almost non-existent. Sometimes on break or in between circuits, if it stayed quiet on campus, I'd read a book or listen to spooky stories on my phone. After listening, I would start to feel a little creeped out for being in a campus hall alone after dark, but I got used to it. It killed the boredom until my next circuit started. I wouldn't find much of anything out of the ordinary, aside from the random object left behind by a student, which I would bring back to the lost and found. I just had to make sure no one else was hanging around after closing. After coming back, I would check the security footage in case I missed something. There were a few screens recording specific spots with the most activity during the day. One for each parking lot, one for each floor in all the buildings, and one for the administrative office. I got decent pay every couple of weeks. After a while, I moved out of my friend's house and got a small apartment and was saving up for a used car. I felt like my luck was starting to turn around finally. Then I had the scariest experience of my life. I was left alone around midnight like always. The campus was absolutely deserted at this time like normal. It was summer during this time, so the night was pretty warm. I felt like I was building a bit of sweat in my security uniform while doing my first circuit. I came back to the security office after finding nothing of note and checked the camera feed. I found nothing in any of the screens until I checked the one for the south lot near the office. While the screen was small, I could discern the moving of a large shadow across one of the lamp posts. It was doing nothing but moving back and forth across the light. The shadow looked too large to be some small bird or animal. I deduced it had to be someone parked off screen so I couldn't visibly see them. I went out there to check things out and found nothing there. If it were a person just fucking around, they would have had to left a sign of their presence. There was nothing left behind. I didn't hear a car driving off or any noise for that matter. I scoped the rest of the south lot to find the source of the shadow. Still nothing. I sighed in annoyance at the thought of some jackass deciding to waste my time. Nothing else happened the rest of the night. I got used to sleeping during the day, but all I could afford to sleep on was a cheap couch that was anything but comfortable. It was rare that I got a full 8 hours of sleep on it. And to top it off, the AC unit had crapped out. My cheap apartment had gotten warmer, making it much harder to sleep. I got to the college at the start of my shift with maybe 4, 5.5 hours of sleep. I had coffee, but it only lasted for so long. With it being extremely late, my office feeling cool, and it being quiet everywhere, I started feeling drowsy. Sleeping on the job wasn't allowed, of course, but every now and then I let myself have a brief nap to refresh myself. So I set my head on the desk and fell asleep instantly. I was later jolted awake. A feeling of something very wrong switched my tired mind on alert and woke me up. I rubbed my eyes and checked the monitors to see if anything was up. I looked at the camera feed for the south lot and my eyes narrowed. Beneath one of the lamp lights, a person was standing. Not doing anything, just being very still. I couldn't make out any details, but this person had long black hair and looked very tall for almost reaching the light. I looked at the bottom of the screen and found the camera was still recording. Whoever the camera was showing was still there. The feeling that jolted me awake intensified and I was aware of myself shaking. A chill colder than the air inside the office crept up my neck. My body was reacting to some sort of danger the image was giving off. Still, a weird person on the security footage was not an excuse to not do my job. I got to the lot in under a minute, and I saw that person still standing under the lamplight, just being dead still. Their back was facing toward me, and their heads seemed to be bowed forward. As I approached closer and tried to get their attention, I found that this trespasser was very tall and lanky, and was wearing a dirty white dress. I called to her again, asking if she needed help, but didn't respond. She just kept standing like a statue where she was. I reached out to touch her and my hand retracted back from the burning sensation her skin gave off, as if she were on fire. I cursed and shook my hand to cool it off, and the lady moved for the first time. Her head tilted upward, as if finally acknowledging I was there. She turned around and I started to track backwards. Her body was humanoid, but she had the head of a goat or a ram. The fur was pitch black, contrasting against her pale skin and white dress. The eyes were red like burning embers, and strands of flesh hung off its curved horns. As my backwards walk sped up, I could hear it give off a deep, thunderous roar. I ran back towards the office, and I swear I could hear the thing sprinting after me. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, and I barricaded myself in the security office. For good measure, I switched off the lights inside and called 911. I told them something was on campus, and they sent someone over. I hung up and strained my ears to hear any noise outside my office. It was hard to notice anything other than the pounding of my heart working overtime. Felt like an eternity before I heard the knocking at the door. The cops notified their presence, and I slowly opened the door. They questioned me about what I called for. When I told them, they looked at me as if I were a mental patient or a drug user. I played the footage back for them, and there the thing was. At the very least, they weren't going to arrest me for making a fake emergency call, but with the trespasser gone, there wasn't much they could do. They left, and I was once again alone. This time I was very afraid. Not that I was alone, but afraid that I wasn't alone, and that thing was still out there. I wasn't taking any chances. I waited in that office and kept the door locked until the end of my shift. I left a note saying I resigned immediately, and I never went back. I always had dreams of being a big city cop. Growing up watching shows like Forensic Files and NYPD Blue inspired me. I dreamed of becoming a hero who fought crime to protect people, but I guess fates had other ideas. Rather than patrolling the streets of Brooklyn or Chicago, I somehow wound up in a small town in the rural Midwest. Nothing but dirt, tumbleweeds, and flat land as far as the eye can see. Some comedian once made a joke about his time living out here, saying he could sit on his porch and watch his dog run away for 3 whole days. His name escapes me now, but that joke is surprisingly accurate. Because of everything that has happened recently, I won't be giving the name of this town. There's a lot I still don't understand about what happened, but I know my superiors would not be happy if I went around babbling around and spreading rumors. Posting this at all is probably a bad idea, but at this point, I don't know what else to do. After landing the job out here, it quickly became apparent that there wasn't much action. That was the norm. But that all changed about a week ago. A fellow officer I'll call Doug and I were on our usual patrol route. This normally consisted of cruising around town and the rural surrounding roads, and occasionally breaking up a high school party. Not exactly the hotbed of criminal activity I'd sort of hoped for. Doug is a senior officer. Been working for the same precinct out here for nearly 30 years. He's a laid-back type, cordial, and doesn't seem in much of a hurry to do anything except on the rare occasion of something happening. The sun was beginning to set in the distance, and Doug was retelling the incident of him facing off with a hungry cougar while trying to help an injured camper. That was a normal evening for us, and I very much enjoyed listening to him recount tales from his pantheon of stories. Doug pulled the cruiser around a bend, in what is essentially the most remote part of our jurisdiction. It's a small valley with multiple foothills, but no one ever really goes out there. As soon as we rounded the corner, though, we saw something we didn't expect. There was a Jeep parked on the shoulder right in front of a hill with the driver's side door propped open. Our headlights beamed over the vehicle, but I saw nobody inside. "The hell is this?" Doug asked, pulling our car over on the adjacent shoulder. The two of us stepped out and approached the desolate vehicle. The lights were off, but it appeared it had only been there a short time. It was weird that whoever drove it there hadn't even bothered to shut the door, though. Doug and I approached, with him taking the lead and approaching the derelict vehicle. He called out to the missing driver, but got no response. He kept his hand on his holster and crept closer as I watched his back. There was no indication anyone was out there aside from the Jeep, but I felt the hairs on the back of my neck bristle. Something wasn't right. I truly hoped we weren't about to stumble upon someone's suicide, but that was the vibe I initially got. Doug reached the side of the Jeep and briefly peered inside. As soon as he saw what was in there, he recoiled back, drawing his revolver and motioning for me to move away. He ordered me to call in backup, looking more frantic than I'd ever see him. "Tell them to send everything," Doug ordered, his gaze glancing around the vicinity with a sudden frenzy. I did as he requested and radioed dispatch, still not understanding what exactly it was that he saw. The dispatch operator confirmed the request, telling me that 2 other units and an ambulance were on the way. "Freeze!" Doug suddenly shouted. I looked up to see him shining his flashlight out in front of the Jeep. There was a man there, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. He was holding something in his hand, but from my vantage point I couldn't tell what it was. Johnny? Johnny, is that you? Doug asked, seeming to recognize him. The man then lifted his head, and I recognized him. A local teenager, native guy with a bit of a checkered history. We've caught him for underage drinking and smoking pot on a few occasions, but never anything severe. Johnny's eyes were vacant, almost sorrowful. He stared back at Doug and swallowed hard. I have to do it, Johnny replied. Doug shook his head, almost silently begging him not to try anything radical. Johnny, just put it down. We can figure this out. Johnny paused for a moment, then shook his head. He inspected the item in his hand, and I realized it was a walkie-talkie. I didn't understand what was happening, but I kept my pistol locked on him. There's no time. I'm sorry. Johnny lifted his arm. Bang. The ambulance arrived on scene a few minutes later, picking up Johnny and rushing him to the town's local hospital. Doug had shot him in the left shoulder, causing him to drop his item. He was thankfully alive and stable, but unfortunately Doug doesn't carry the standard 9mm. Instead, patrolling around with his revolver .44 Magnum. That one bullet did some rather severe damage, and I still didn't understand why any of it was necessary. Doug ordered all of us away from the scene, refusing to allow anyone near the Jeep or even telling us what he found inside. Several hours later, a special unit from a larger, neighboring precinct arrived. Things finally started coming together after that. Johnny's Jeep was loaded with nearly 30 pounds of pyrotechnic flash powder, the stuff used in fireworks. He'd crammed it into nearly 24 small cylinders and wrapped them tightly with 2 propane tanks and a walkie-talkie. It was a bomb, a rather large one which he had rigged to the other walkie-talkie to allow for remote detonation. Johnny's father owns a fireworks chain, and after scouring his warehouse, we found that's where Johnny had acquired his supplies. Johnny was a rebellious teenager, but I never would have thought him a terrorist. The bomb squad managed to successfully dismantle his device without incident, but the whole scenario still didn't make much sense. Johnny was unconscious for days afterwards, and the .44 round that had hit him turned out to have caused more damage than initially thought. Doctors said he would survive, but would face extensive recovery. Doug took the incident harder than any of us, but since our suspect was unconscious, the only thing we could do to learn more was return to the scene of the crime. The Jeep had been removed by then, so myself, Doug, and 2 other officers traced his route on foot. There was a small valley which led into a few rocky foothills, but no indication of a possible target. No one lives in that area, nor anywhere close, really. That was partially relieving, as we were afraid Johnny was intending to hurt a lot of people, but that didn't seem to be the case. After only a few minutes of following the small ravine, we found something. A narrow opening was carved into the side of one of the hills, looking as though it was an old mining tunnel entrance. Upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't just caved in. It actually appeared as though a large stone slab sealed the entrance. It was one solid piece and not just rubble. I found that quite curious, but didn't exactly know what to make of it. The town has dozens of old mines from the early gold rush days, but they've all been shut down for decades now. Furthermore, we haven't been able to find any evidence of a mine ever existing in that particular spot. I got this odd feeling as we approached it, like a heavy static electricity in the air. The hairs on my arms and head seemed to stand erect, and I noticed it on the others as well. Normally this can be a very worrying sign and can sometimes indicate that lightning is about to strike. The sky was clear though, and that didn't seem likely. Something about it was oddly unnerving in a way I don't know how to fully articulate. We lingered there for a few minutes, but didn't find much of interest there or anywhere else. We left shortly after and took the short trail back to our vehicles. I don't know whether it was just my nerves mounting, but I felt incredibly nervous on my way back. I felt like we were being watched. Johnny thankfully woke up 2 days later, and Doug and I returned to the hospital to question him. He was still quite out of it, likely a reaction to his medication and condition. His father was there, and at first he denied us permission to interview his son, until Johnny himself insisted upon speaking to us. Both his father and us were quite taken aback by that request, but we're all too happy to oblige. "Where's my Jeep?" Johnny asked as Doug and I entered the room. "Impound. Bomb squad dismantled it." Doug replied matter-of-factly. He sat in a chair opposing Johnny, who appeared quite distressed by the admission. "You have to go back out there. There's not much time." Johnny then tried moving upward, but cringed as pain shot through his shoulder. He gritted his teeth and reluctantly sat back down, breaths falling frantic from his lips. "I'm not going anywhere, Johnny. Not until you tell us what you were doing. You could be in a lot of trouble here. What were you doing with all those explosives?" "The tunnel," he replied without a moment's hesitation, making no effort to downplay his intent. "We have to destroy it." Doug shot me a confused glance, and I posed a question. "That mine shaft? Is that what you mean?" Johnny shook his head. "It's not a mine shaft." Johnny's eyes were almost frantic then, and his breathing almost turned to hyperventilations. "You've been out there, right? You saw it?" he asked. "We found it, Johnny. It's already sealed." Johnny then vehemently shook his head. "It won't stay that way. It opens every couple of days." Doug and I exchanged another perturbed glance. I'm sure he wanted to write off Johnny as some sort of eccentric, but there was an obvious desperate pleading in his voice that made me take pause. "Please," Johnny begged, eyes starting to water. "Why, Johnny?" I asked, leaning in. "What's in there?" Doug seemed annoyed I was even engaging in his delusion, but Johnny was clearly petrified by something, and I wanted to know what it was. "I don't know. Something horrible. I've seen people post about them online. We have to destroy it." We didn't get much more out of him than that. He just kept begging us to finish what he wasn't able to do. He also said something about how things will come out, which made my skin crawl. I didn't understand how a normal kid like Johnny had suddenly become so obsessed with detonating an old tunnel, but I couldn't deny the odd feeling it gave me, and the pleading desperation in his voice. Doug and I left, realizing he wasn't going to tell us much more than that. After a bit of math, I realized that if what Johnny had said was true, then the mineshaft was set to open the following morning around 3 a.m. Doug believed it was a load of hogwash, but I felt the least I could do was investigate Johnny's claims. It didn't seem possible, I know, and Doug told me I was being thrown for a loop, but I felt like there was something more to it. Johnny was a troubled kid, as I mentioned, but he didn't seem like a liar. So myself and 2 other officers, Hastings and Gunnarsson, returned to the scene of the incident. Doug elected to stay behind, convinced there was nothing of interest out there. It probably has something to do with the fact that we had to be out there by 3 a.m. as well, and Doug was not in any way a morning person. According to Johnny, 3 a.m. the following day was when the tunnel was set to open once again, whatever that meant. I thought that whatever this was, there would be a logical explanation to it. I met Hastings and Gunnarsson out there, just before 3 a.m. the following morning. Both of them only seemed slightly awake, and also slightly remorseful over their decision to meet me. A thick fog lingered over the foothills, sprinkling a chilly dew over the environment. I tucked my coat up around my neck, trying to ignore the chills rolling down my spine. The 3 of us sat around sipping coffee for about half an hour until 3 a.m. rolled around. Suddenly an odd, abrasive noise permeated the dark atmosphere. It sounded like heavy rock scraping against rock, a loud, oppressive grinding that made me clench my teeth. It sounded like it was coming from the ravine up ahead, and it made the cold air dip a few more degrees. Hastings and Gunnarsson clearly seemed unnerved by it as well. Gunnarsson wondered aloud whether it was a rock slide, but I wasn't so sure the explanation was that simple. The three of us crept our way around the gully. It seemed like the fog was getting thicker the further we went. Got so bad that visibility was soon limited to maybe 20 yards. Something's not right. Hastings spoke what I was also feeling. There was an odd quality to the fog, like some ill-defined heaviness that lingered within it. It didn't feel natural. Despite the red flags, I foolishly insisted we continue onward. We were only about 50 yards from the tunnel entrance, and I needed to see it again. Something incredibly strange happened then. What I can only describe as a sudden head rush then struck me. Like my brain had been jump-started into overdrive. My vision began to alter, in a way I don't fully know how to explain. It was like my perception just suddenly shifted. Little tracers trailed off the rocks around me, and the ground appeared like it was breathing in and out. I'm pretty vanilla when it comes to drug usage, and although I've never taken them personally, it almost felt like what I was experiencing was similar to accounts of mushrooms and LSD trips I've read online. Out of nowhere, Hastings suddenly began to giggle. Both Gunnarsson and I looked back to him in confusion. His eyes were darting around like flies, and he had this almost manic smile on his face. The hell's so funny? Gunnarsson's eyes were wide as saucers when he asked it, and I could tell he was feeling it too. I feel weird. What did you put in that coffee? Hastings asked. Needless to say, I hadn't put anything in the coffee, especially not hallucinogenic drugs. There was something in the air itself that was messing with our minds. I then just decided to go all out and made a mad dash towards the tunnel. The feeling got worse the closer I got. The world degraded to a foreign flurry in my eyes, and the rocky ground became as turbulent as an unruly sea. I could barely keep myself upright, and barely even decipher what was around me. Then by some miracle, I saw it. The tunnel emerged from the dense fog, but this time the entrance was open. From behind me I heard Hastings giggle, erupt into a bellow of laughter, like a mad scientist bringing Frankenstein back to life. Gunnarsson then screamed and I booked it. I took one last glance at the tunnel as I fled, and I swear there was something in there looking back at me. Something I don't even know how to begin describing. Something that just shouldn't exist. I ran like never before in my life, suddenly consumed by the fear I felt. Both Gunnarsson and Hastings were no longer where I'd seen them last. From further within the canopy of fog, I heard Hastings continue to cackle like a madman, but I never caught sight of him. The crippling mental haze seemed to alleviate the further I got from the tunnel, and by the time I reached the vehicles, I felt completely coherent once more. Gunnarsson was standing there panting with quivering hands. "Where's Hastings?" I asked as I joined him. Gunnarsson looked back at me in terror. "He followed after you." From behind us, I saw the fog slowly drifting outwards, as if it were some singular entity drifting in the wind. I no longer heard Hastings' laughter, and I knew if we didn't leave, then we wouldn't at all. Gunnarsson and I fled, leaving Hastings behind. I called Doug on the way, trying to convey everything that had just happened. I don't know how much he understood from my frantic rant, mixed with his sudden awakening, but he seemed to understand that Hastings was in trouble. He and I rendezvoused at the station about 20 minutes later, and I reiterated the account above. Doug didn't seem to know what to make of my story, but he did understand that Hastings was missing. He rallied everyone in the police force to go back and search, albeit Gunnarsson, who vehemently refused to go back. He and Doug got into a heated argument about it, and Gunnarsson tossed his badge into the dirt, claiming no job was worth going back there before storming off. I'll admit I was absolutely terrified of going back, but I knew we had to help Hastings. It was my fault he was out there to begin with, and I had to do my part. Turns out it may have been too late, as by the time Doug and I returned with reinforcements, we found no trace of him. The fog was gone by that point too, and the tunnel sealed back up just as it was the first time we'd found it. Doug began to amass a search team and ordered me to go home, get some rest and decompress from the situation. My girlfriend Samantha could see that something had happened, but I didn't tell her about it. I think the adrenaline had finally worn off, and I felt a severe drowsiness setting in. Last thing I remember was slumping on the couch of our apartment, only to be awakened several hours later by Samantha shaking me vigorously. "Mark, something's happening. Wake up. I feel really weird." As my eyes sprung open, I saw the room distort around me similar to how it had previously. That unnerving mental haze was back, and that could only mean one thing. She and I got our dog Max as our perceptions continued to disintegrate and fled. Max was going ballistic all the way to the car, switching from snarling like he'd gone rabid to whining pitifully. It was dark again, and from all around us, laughter and cries from the other residents in our complex. I wanted to help them, but in the moment, I only cared about getting Samantha and Max to safety. By the time we reached Samantha's car, there were screams echoing out from within the complex. Other residents were fleeing as well, but many were still inside. By the time we hit Main Street, the town's tornado siren had begun blaring in the distance. Samantha asked me what the hell was going on, but I didn't even know how to respond. I dialed Doug, and he instructed me to meet him at the station with a trembling urgency in his voice. We got there only a few minutes later, and I told Samantha to take the car and Max and get to safety. She had tears in her eyes and asked me what was going on, but I didn't have time to tell her then. I just told her I loved her, and I'd call her as soon as I could. She agreed, and I watched her drive off as I returned to the moment at hand. Doug rallied every officer at our precinct, which was only 9 of us because the town is so small, and sent them back to the apartments. Only Hastings was missing, but the rest arrived shortly after we did. Doug had said that dispatch had been flooded with 911 calls from multiple residents of the complex. I felt the horrific guilt of the situation sink deep into my skull, causing my mind to throb. Everything in my mind and gut was screaming for me to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't. I couldn't just abandon everyone who lived there. After all, whatever was happening there, it was happening because of me. That thing had come back for me. Several people were in the parking lot as we arrived. They appeared delirious and confused, with most of them in their pajamas as if they'd had to leave very quickly. Doug ordered all of them away from the buildings as we began to conduct interviews and ask if anyone was injured. I spoke with an elderly lady, Martha, who had lived in the unit below Samantha and mine ever since we'd moved in. She was all but petrified, and clutched her Pomeranian tightly in her hands. Her nose was bleeding, but thankfully she didn't appear too badly injured. I spoke with her as she held a rag to her nose, tears falling faster from her eyes with every word. She told me she had suddenly been awakened by a strange feeling. She felt woozy, and since she's diabetic, she thought perhaps her insulin levels were low. She then saw her husband, sitting in their bedroom closet, giggling. She stumbled towards him, calling out and expressing her fears that she may be having a medical emergency. Without warning, she said that her husband, Frank, suddenly lashed out and slapped her across the face. He then returned to the closet, holding his knees and giggling. Martha fled after that, and that decision probably saved her life. She began sobbing, saying that Frank had never done anything like that, and she was worried he might be sick. I've conversed with Frank myself dozens of times, and he never would have struck me as the type to abuse his wife. She told me that he was still inside and begged me to go check on him. Doug got on his speaker and instructed everyone to leave the complex immediately. We were worried that the building may have sprung a gas leak, which could have possibly explained Martha and the other residents' symptoms. But it was clearly far beyond that. Not a single person came outside. There's only maybe 50 residents in our entire complex, and most of them were already outside, although we estimated that at least a dozen were still within. 2 of our officers approached one of the entrances as the remainder of us covered them. I watched their steps grow more hobbled and awkward the closer they got, until one of them actually fell over entirely, propping himself up with his arm. He then heaved and vomited on the concrete and turned back as the other officer tried pulling him back to his feet. The two of them managed to get back to the rest of us, brandishing looks of terror reminiscent of the other residents. No one went near the building after that. No one else came out. It was just a stalemate that went on long into the night. Doug kept on the intercom periodically instructing people to evacuate, but no one ever did. The other residents were ferried away from the scene, with many of them being forced to abandon loved ones still inside. Every now and then we'd hear laughter. Screaming or other less definable sounds reverberate from inside the building. We got glimpses of silhouettes within, but never anything entirely clear. No one really understood what was going on, but after the first officer's experiences and other residents' testimonies, no one wanted to risk going in there. The sun finally rose the following day, and the real bizarre situation took on an entirely new perspective. It had been hours since anything was heard from within the building, but something became clear as the smoldering sun beamed down upon it. The building itself was different. Some spots looked almost melted, while others seemed to have elongated and grown taller or wider. It's like the building itself was suffering from the odd haze that had affected myself and the other residents. Not long after the sun had risen, an entourage of black Suburbans suddenly rolled up to the scene, followed soon after by a SWAT truck. Like some cliché entourage, a group of men in black suits exited the trucks and approached Doug. They spent a minute or two conversing before Doug looked back to the rest of us. Much to my surprise and relief, we were told we could leave, and the men in black would handle the situation. By that point, I'd been up for nearly 24 hours, and wanted nothing more than to just sleep. Probably should have asked a few more questions before leaving, but I was barely awake enough to even remain standing by that point. I assumed those guys were CIA or some other secret government agency, but I haven't been able to confirm that. That was about a week ago now, and as of writing this, that's about where we stand. I haven't been able to return back to my apartment since, and have since been told by Doug that I likely never will. They're considering that entire property and the 11 individuals still inside to be already lost. Doug hasn't told me much more than that. I don't know if they've ever told him the full extent of what's happening. Clearly whatever is in that building is significantly above our jurisdiction. The ravine with the tunnel is also now under the supervision of the unnamed government agents. I never would have imagined myself at the epicenter of something like this. I guess in some cruel twist of irony, I finally got the large-scale case I always wanted, but I never could have envisioned it being like this. Whatever it was that was in that tunnel, and is now in that building, it's way beyond us. I want to think there's some logical explanation to this, like some gas leak in the mine caused me to hallucinate and then somehow spread to our apartment complex. I'd be a fool to believe that after everything that's happened, though. Whatever happened to me and the others, it wasn't in any way natural. It was like that thing invaded my mind, and proximity to it strengthened the strange psychic aura it possesses. Whatever power it has even seemed to distort the building itself. Never got a good look at it, but what kind of thing could warp your mind simply by being near it? Just as Johnny had said, I managed to find a few stories online of people finding these tunnels. I don't know how much of what I read was fiction, but no one seems to have an explanation for them. People just apparently seem to stumble across them one day, oftentimes in places they hadn't been before. If anyone reading this has a possible explanation for all this, then please feel free to comment. I'm at a loss to explain this, and I'll admit, I've never been much of a believer in the whole supernatural stuff. Nothing I've found online seems to explain what that thing is, natural or otherwise. Hastings is still missing. And last I heard, those people are still locked inside that building. Whatever the truth is, I just hope that no more of those tunnels are out there. God knows what kind of things may come out of them. August 4th, 2016. What a strange thing to admit. I guess there could be worse problems. like peeing the bed or wet dreams. But still, it's not something I am proud of. It started when I was a kid. I like to think it's a pretty common occurrence among children. 1 second you're enjoying your dream, the next, bonk. Suddenly your head hurts, you're crying, and you have no idea why. About 20 seconds later, mom is in the room wondering what happened. Then before you know it, you're back in your bed fast asleep. Then eventually you grow out of it, just like you grow out of other embarrassing accidents that happen when you're young. Except when you don't grow out of it, because inevitably, I didn't. Now here I am, a 22-year-old college grad who still falls out of the bed at night. I wouldn't consider myself a wild dreamer. Nothing out of the ordinary. Sometimes I'm not even dreaming. I just feel that same bonk I have always felt growing up. I don't cry anymore, could you imagine? Instead, I just get up, make my way back to my bed, and wonder when I will finally outgrow this. Although secretly, I know I likely never will. Maybe it's stress. Nobody warned me my first year out of college would be this rough. Juggling a breakup and a difficult job search has been taking a mental toll on me. Plus, living with my parents hasn't been easy. The only reason I am even writing this down is because I plan on telling my psychologist when I see him tomorrow. I like to get my thoughts on paper, especially when they're this fresh. He's a good guy. I don't know why I haven't told him sooner. I guess I never really saw it as that big of a deal. But my head still hurts from my tumble last night. I think it's time I finally tell someone my secret. August 5th, 2016. I told him, and he reacted basically like I thought he would. Just a little smirk, but not in a mocking way. He told me to establish my bedtime routine and stay off my phone an hour before bed. He mentioned something else I found interesting. He said something like, make your room an oasis. Make your bed every day. Make going to sleep at night something you always look forward to. Fair enough. So, that begins tonight. No more scrolling past 10 p.m. or so. If anything, it'll be better for my mental health. I'll even clean my room. Why the hell not? It'll make my dad happy for once. Pick up your pants and close your goddamn closet. His voice still rings in my head. From yelling at me to study for the SAT to yelling at me for having an untidy closet. Nothing is ever good enough. Maybe that'll change once I clean my room. Maybe I will get through the night without falling out of my bed. August 6th, 2016. Bonk. Well, so much for that. It was worth a shot at least. If anything, I did feel slightly less stressed out not scrolling through social media, and it felt pretty good cleaning my room. Dad walked in and said, well, look who's finally taking care of his room. I don't know why, but that single comment made me want to stop. But I didn't. I was committed. And yet, I still rolled right out of my bed. It's okay though, I really had to pee. When I get back, I notice something strange. My closet. Is it open? I guess I forgot to close it. It's just... well, that's the one thing my dad is such a pain in the ass about. So you'd think I would take care of it. So what was it doing open? Did I open it in my sleep? Is that even possible? You know, I think I'm just going to head back to bed. My head hurts. August 10th, 2016. Bonk. Again? Alright, this is a little strange. When I first started writing these entries, I would fall out, I don't know, once every other month. But now it's been a few days. Can't believe this shit is getting worse. I don't know what's going on with me. I'm still lying on the hardwood floor of my room. I don't even want to get up. Maybe I will just spend the night here. That way there's nowhere else to fall. Yeah, maybe not. The floor creaks as I get up. The house must be ancient. There is a creak with each step I take back to my bed. Creak, creak, creak. I make it to my bed and rest my head on the pillow. It was still in pain from when I fell a few nights back, but now it's even worse. Just as I feel myself starting to doze off, I hear it creak. I burst awake and stare around my room. Nothing. At least the closet door stayed closed this time. For a second, I was starting to get nervous. I don't really believe in ghosts or anything like that, but it's still creepy. Maybe if the house wasn't so old. Hell, maybe I even dreamt it. I'm still super tired, and yet, right as I start to fall asleep, creak. I pick my head up again. Still nothing. Right as I begin to lower my head to my pillow, something catches my eye. Closet. Is it? I fall back asleep. August 13th, 2016. No bonk this time. I made it through the night, so that should be a good thing, right? Except I'm in pain. My head is still throbbing from the past few times I fell out of my bed. Why? I have no idea. But it sucks, I can tell you that much. I told my psychologist about the strange occurrences I had been experiencing. He laughed it off and said something along the lines of, "So this is what happens when you finally stop using your phone at night." Typical boomer thing to say, but he's not even wrong. I'm not the kind of person who overreacts. I feel like I've made that relatively clear this far, and yet something doesn't seem right. It's almost as if one thing in nights is ever so slightly out of place. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm about as absent-minded as it gets, so it could be all in my head. Maybe I am misplacing things. It's just, with what has happened the past few nights, it seems like at this point, it's not a coincidence. Maybe I just need to lay off the horror movies. To be safe, I cleaned and organized my room. As a matter of fact, I've been doing that every night. It's almost like the more I clean things up, the more things in my room just don't seem right. I mean, even my dad is starting to get concerned. Just now, as I'm cleaning all my shit yet again, he said, "You know, Trevor, you don't need to clean every night." How ironic. Never in a million years would I expect to hear those words from my dad. But after all, these have been strange days. August 14th, 2016. Bonk. Ouch. This time the blanket came off with me. It's still on my face when I suddenly hear it. Crash. I struggle for a second, then manage to pull the covers over my head. All of my little figurines and books on my dresser are now on the floor. Some are broken. How? I frantically look around. I open my closet, and yes, I look under my bed. There's nothing. Nobody. I am alone in my room. But that's impossible. I would be lying if I said I wasn't terrified. I just pull my covers over my head and try to fall back asleep. That's when I hear footsteps outside my room. I'm about to reach full-on panic mode when I suddenly hear my mom's voice. "Trevor, are you alright?" "Yeah," I call out. "Some things fell, but that's it." No response from my mother. I look up at my door and I see the handle start to turn, then stop. "Mom?" No answer. So I do it. I get out of bed and make my way over to my door. I take a deep breath, put my hand on the door handle, turn, and open. There is nobody there. So I do something I haven't done in maybe 10 years. I quickly make my way over to my parents' room, knock, and open. They're beyond passed out. My mother, she's as asleep as it gets. There's a cool breeze that brushes my neck, almost as though someone is ever so slightly laughing. I quickly turn around and there is nothing there. Again, I'm alone. So, petrified as can be, I head back to bed. August 21st, 2016. It's been a few days since my last fall, but I can feel myself changing. I'm anxious all the time. My hands are shaking as I write this. I I feel like I'm hearing things. I am reliving those nights I fell. I can feel that cool air on my neck. I can hear my mother's voice on the other side of my door. Or whoever it was. Worst of all, I haven't been able to speak to my psychologist in several days, as he's away on vacation. Maybe that's what I need. I haven't bothered telling my folks about any of this. I don't think they would understand. They probably wouldn't even believe me. Mom, I think our house is haunted. I'm laughing even thinking that. Perhaps a better assessment would be, Mom, I think I am losing my fucking mind. Two things could be true at once. If one thing has stayed consistent, it's my neuroticism with cleaning. It is as if things can never be clean enough. I will dust, then dust again. Sweep, then sweep again. But most importantly, I organize and close my closet door. All I need is a good night's sleep, and in the morning I'll feel better. August 22nd, 2016. Bonk. Something is different this time. Somehow I ended up at the foot of my bed. How is that even possible? I couldn't have rolled off. I must have been. No, stop. Nobody pulled me off. There's nobody in the room with me. There's nobody in the room with me. There's nobody. Thump. My eyes dart to my closet, which is where the noise came from. I'm too scared to take a closer look, but I force myself to do so. As I approach my closet, I can see it's trashed. I didn't do this. Someone else did. As I take a step closer, I feel something touch my back. Before I can turn and look, it pushes me into the closet and closes the door. Help! I scream. I try to open the door, but my efforts are in vain. I keep fighting with the door to no avail. At this point, yes, I am crying. I just want to be left alone. I stop fussing with the door and listen to see if I can hear anything. Creak, 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 thump. My heart jumps with the most recent bang. My hands are shaking. I push the door open and see my empty room. I take a deep breath. Who's there? Like whatever this thing is would even answer. You know what? Fuck it. I run downstairs and jump on the living room sofa. Close my eyes, and before I know it, it's morning. August 24th, 2016. I convince myself it's time to tell my parents. They didn't laugh, shockingly. But I can tell they don't believe me. My mom tells me I am just stressed and sleep deprived. My dad says it's all in my head, and the more I worry about falling out of the bed at night, the more I likely will. Since when is he some kind of psychologist? As nighttime draws closer, I decide it's best to sleep on the sofa in the living room for a few nights. At least the floor is carpeted there. So if I do fall, it won't hurt as much. And maybe, whatever has been bothering me, is it in my head? Will leave me alone. So that's what I do. I clean the area around the living room sofa. I bring my pillow and blanket down and lie down right as my dad walks in. What are you doing? I think I need a change of scenery or something like that. Maybe it will help me sleep better. I just don't want to be in my room right now. You're being ridiculous. Go back upstairs. I look at the sofa, which already has my pillow and blanket on it. Maybe he's right. Maybe. No. I abruptly tell him. This is just for tonight. Please. My dad sighs and heads back upstairs. I lay my head on the pillow and shut my eyes. Hours later, I wake up naturally for a change. Once again, I need to use the bathroom. I take a deep breath and make my way upstairs. Leave the bathroom door open while I pee. As I hit flush and wash my hands, I can hear something coming from downstairs. Creak, creak, creak. Footsteps. But it's carpeted down there. I walk back downstairs to the living room to find my blanket and pillow are on the floor, not where I left them. As I bend down to pick them up, I hear the sound again. This time, the noises are closer together and louder. Creak, creak, creak. Click. I abruptly turn around to see my kitchen light on. Suddenly there are more footsteps. Creak, 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 crash. My mind enters fight or flight mode, and with all my strength I enter the kitchen to find it completely empty. Who are you? Where are you? What do you want? More footsteps come down the stairs as I hear my mother's voice again. Trevor, what's wrong? What's going on? Oh no. Shut up, leave me alone. A figure enters the kitchen and I am relieved to see it's my mother. I take a few deep breaths and look around the kitchen. It's a wreck. Plates broken on the floor, chairs have been pushed over, and cutlery is everywhere. Trevor, what happened? I freeze. Mom, is the only thing I can manage to say. That's the last thing I remember. August 28th, 2016. They're saying it was a severe anxiety attack, but it wasn't. They're saying I'm a threat to my parents. I'm not. They think I'm suicidal. It's not that. They think keeping me in a hospital for a few days will be a magic cure. It won't. Something is after me and nothing will change my mind and make me think otherwise. Why would hiding me away here make a difference? Here's a severely anxious and delusional person. Let's shove them in a hospital. What could go wrong? I refuse to sleep. I don't even close my eyes anymore because that's when it comes out. That's when it finds me. Been evaluated a few times. From what I hear, I will be going home soon. Home is the last place I want to be. I can feel it getting closer with every night, and one day soon it will come for me. August 30th, 2016. Sitting in the car on the way home makes me nauseous. As we arrive, I get out of the car and immediately vomit. My parents look concerned. I've given up hope at this point. I watch the hours on the clock. 7 p.m. turns to 8, 8 turns to 9, 9 turns to 10. Before I know it, my parents are asleep. I take a look at myself in the mirror. What a mess. There's still vomit on my shirt. My eyes are dark and bloodshot. My hands are shaking. Still, I go through my routine. There is nothing in my closet, nothing under my bed, and nobody in the room with me. I repeat this a few times, even though I don't believe it. Maybe if I keep saying it, I will eventually believe myself. There is nobody in the room with me. There's nobody in the room with me. There is nobody. My closet creaks open. I slam it shut and go to bed. August 31st, 2016. Have you ever experienced a lucid dream? What a strange phenomenon. I am aware I am dreaming, therefore can control anything. I can fly, become invisible, anything I want. So what do I choose to do during this lucid dream? Sleep in peace. Yet suddenly I can see a bird's eye view of a man in a bed, snug under covers. He is tossing and turning, sweating bullets, yelling out in his sleep. Demonic hands suddenly appear and shove him out of his bed. Bonk. Wait, that person I was watching, was it me? Then I was pushed. I try to get out from under my sheets, but something is holding me down. I scream for my parents like a 7-year-old child. Mom, Dad. Nothing. I can see a silhouette of the same demonic hand over my sheets. I struggle to get out of its grasp, but I am stuck. Suddenly the silhouette disappears and I escape from my sheets. I untangle myself and stand up. The sleep deprivation has gotten to me. I'm seeing double. Creak, creak, creak. I turn around. As I look back, I can feel the same burst of cool air on my neck. Creak, creak, creak. Suddenly the noise stops. There is a sudden sharp pain in my shoulders as something grasps me with full might and throws me into the closet. The door slams shut. I frantically bang on it. Help me. I bang as loud as I can and struggle with the door. Finally it opens and I am face to face with it. It found me. March 1st, 2019. Scott was cleaning out his son's closet for the first time since he tragically passed away from unexpected heart failure when he found a journal covered in a layer of dust. Journey to Conquering a Good Night's Sleep, it ran. The first entry was dated August 4th from a few years earlier. Every now and then I fall out of bed at night. It began. Entranced, Scott read through every entry, fighting back tears. He had discussed his son's issues with his wife before, but now it was evident they should have sought help sooner. He thought about showing his wife, but decided it was best to leave it be. She was struggling enough. He puts the journal back where he found it and closes his closet door, just the way he always likes it. As he walks away, the closet door creaks open again. Scott turns around, but inevitably decides to ignore it. As he gets ready for bed, he can't shake some of the deceptions his son had used in his journal. Dark figures, demonic hands. What was really going on in his son's head? His wife joins him in bed and they turn off the light. Every day, things get a little better. That night, Scott woke up on the floor, having fallen out of his bed for the first time since he was a child. Picture this. You're walking home one evening. You're alone and the streets are empty. You walk a path you have walked 1,000 times. Suddenly you spot a road you've never seen before. Maybe there's suddenly a cozy bridge crossing a large river that usually forces you to take a detour. Maybe there's a meandering path crossing a flowery meadow where there should be a construction site. Maybe you find that a tranquil alley has replaced the busy motorway in front of your home. The road looks completely different each time, but some things are always the same about it. It is short, it is peaceful, and it will grant you your deepest desire. Imagine that. Imagine that taking it will give you whatever you want most in life. Start on one end and reach the other. That's all you have to do. There's a catch. Of course there's a catch. There's always a catch with these sort of things, isn't there? I live in a small town surrounded by steep mountainous hills. A little road behind my house leads up a steep incline, circling one of these hills until finally ending in front of an old vineyard. The place gets busy in autumn when harvest season rolls around, but right now you'll at most encounter the occasional hiker along the route. I've started hiking up there myself. Part of my New Year's resolution. I need to slim down a little after a year spent sitting around in quarantine, eating comfort food. So now I hike up the mountain 3 times each week, a bit higher each time. It was on one of these trips that I encountered the vagrant. I had sat down on a large rock in the shade of a lone pine tree and was about to bite into the sandwich I had taken along as provisions. Suddenly a disheveled figure stumbled into view. He was thin, his dusty clothes too wide for his scrawny body. A thick beard covered his face and dirty strands of hair hung down from his skull in a wild, tangled chaos. He took a few steps, dragging his feet over the asphalt. Then he noticed me. He approached, his hungry gaze fixated on the food, then looked away, feigning disinterest, and dropped down to the ground where he pretended to massage his ankles. I instinctively scooped away from this figure, protectively clutching my food closer towards my chest. He watched me from the corner of his eyes. What was this guy doing here? There was nothing up this dead-end road. There were no cars, no people. There was nothing up here. Did he just get lost? I was about to scoop away even further when I noticed his shoes. It was hard to even call these things shoes considering the state they were in. The soles were worn down to the point they had basically ceased existing. His bare feet were clearly visible through the large gaps, coated in dirt, swollen, calloused. Something had recently torn into the skin beneath his big toe. Clotted blood spread all around the fresh injury. I I instantly felt regret at how I had reacted to the stranger a moment ago. All that suspicion and distrust. I cleared my throat. Hey, you want a bite to eat? I leaned slightly towards him and held out the piece of bread. His head snapped up as if he had just waited for this cue. Oh, yeah, he said with a raspy voice. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. He rose back up and took a few more steps towards me, limping slightly whenever his injured foot touched the ground. As soon as he was close enough, he reached out, hesitated for a second, then snatched the sandwich from my fingers, and with a sudden motion, as if afraid I might withdraw the offer at any second, his body dropped down into the dirt again. Thank you, he managed to say with his bulging cheeks as he hungrily took the first few bites. The bread vanished in record time. He wolfed down the food, clearly not bothering to chew half of the time, and I looked away to give him a bit of privacy. Have you ever heard of this road that'll make your deepest wish come true? He suddenly said. He was still chewing, but he had slowed down enough to become a bit more intelligible. No, I answered with some hesitation. Picture this. You're walking home one evening. You're alone and the streets are empty. You walk a path you have walked 1,000 times. Suddenly you spot a road you've never seen before. He paused to take another bite. I leaned closer, still slightly confused by the direction our conversation was taking. Was he just sharing some sort of hobo legend to repay me for the food? Maybe there's suddenly a cozy bridge crossing the large river that usually forces you to take a detour. He continued. Maybe there's a meandering path crossing a flowery meadow where there should be a construction site. Or maybe... He suddenly stopped and looked into the distance, his eyes unfocused. Maybe you find that a tranquil alley has replaced the busy motorway in front of your home. He shook his head and pulled himself out of whatever vision had suddenly haunted him. The road looks completely different each time, but some things are always the same about it. It is short, it is peaceful, and it will grant you your deepest desire. He looked down at the last few bites that remained of the sandwich. Imagine that. Imagine that. Imagine that taking it will give you whatever you want most in life. His fingers tensed against the bread and a few crumbs of the crust fell to the ground. Start on one end and reach the other. That's all you have to do. He raised the last bite to his lips. But there's a catch. Of course there's a catch. There's always a catch with these sort of things, isn't there? His mouth opened and the sandwich disappeared. For a bit he just sat there, silently chewing while I nervously tapped my fingers against my knees, waiting for him to continue. What's the catch? My voice finally broke the silence. I had gotten more involved in his narration than I could have anticipated. He looked at me, then down at his now empty palms, as if waiting for more food to magically appear there. The catch? He mumbled. The catch, right. The catch is that you have to walk the road with your eyes closed. No blinking or peeking no matter what. Doesn't sound so bad, right? It's such a short and straightforward route. How hard could it be to do this blind? His voice broke and he closed his eyes, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It seems so easy until you reach the middle of the road and the sounds come. A startling scream as if some terrifying beast has appeared in front of you. Beautiful angelic music beckoning you to look at its creator. The voice of a loved one who just passed away. No matter what you hear, keep your eyes closed. Or else what? Or else, well, it is said that. He stared down at the ground while one of his hands rubbed his injured foot. The wound had opened up again and fresh blood was seeping over his soul. According to the legend, you'll be trapped on this road forever. Oh, sure, you'll reach the end, but then you take a turn and you take another, and suddenly you notice that you have stepped onto the road again. It looks different again, but you can tell somehow. So you turn around and try to retrace your steps, but the path you just came from seems to have suddenly changed, and stumble across it confused, and then you look down and you notice that you are on the road again. His breathing grew louder and more rapid. His hands wildly motioned in the air in front of him. So then you start running and running, faster and faster until your legs hurt, and still you keep running. The landscape flies by, rapidly changing, but no matter how much it changes, there is one thing that always stays the same. You are on the road again and again and again. And you sink down exhausted, and when you wake up, you are back. And you walk for days and months and years, hungry and cold and tired, until you finally decide to end it all. So you do, and you feel yourself fade away, and you think you have finally escaped, and then your eyes close, and your breathing stops, and you grow cold, and then your eyes fly open, and you're back on the road. His voice had become more and more intense the longer he had spoken. He was shaking. His eyes were staring into the distance again. I noticed that I had grown equally tense. I rubbed my upper arm in an attempt to fight off the shivering feeling that had crept beneath my skin. Then I forced out a polite little chuckle. "Well, that's quite a story," I said. "Just one little hole. How could we ever find out what happens to those who open their eyes? If the story is true, they're trapped on the road forever, right? They'll hardly be able to tell anyone what happened, right?" Rationalizing the story in this way helped me to get a grip of myself. He had told it quite convincingly, but in the end, it was just some silly little legend. He nodded, then turned his legs towards his body. "Yeah, you're right. I guess you're right." His head dipped forward and squeezed itself against his knees. "It was a car horn, you know." "What?" I said, unable to really grasp this sudden non sequitur. "No demonic voices or angelic messages or siren songs. Just a damn car horn. And I was sure I had made it to the other end, and that I had accidentally stumbled into the road, so I just... He fell silent. I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing as I struggled to find the appropriate answer to this strange outburst. Before I found the right words, he suddenly pulled his upper body away from his knees, shook his head and let out a laugh. Sorry about that. I'm just tired. It's getting late." He stretched his legs and began standing up. "Well," he said, trying to get a sense of levity back into his voice, "what would you wish for if you ever stumbled on the road?" "I don't know. Money? Eternal youth? I guess I'm not really creative when it comes to this stuff." I gave him a smile. "What about you? What's your deepest desire?" He stared at the horizon, which was slowly turning orange from the setting sun. "Getting home," he said with a gravelly voice. Then he took a deep breath and began to walk away. I sat there, the weight of those last few words pulling me down. When he had vanished behind the last corner, I came to a sudden decision, jumped up, and began jogging after him. It felt wrong to just send him away like that. I was sure I still had a pair of sturdy shoes at home. Shoes I never wore anyway. Might be the right size for him. Better than his current pair in any case. He'd pass my house anyway on the way down. I rounded the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. There should have been only one way to go. One single serpentine road taking a sharp turn to the right, clinging to the mountainside. Now, however, there was a second road branching off. It led straight forward through a calm patch of forest where there should have been nothing but empty air. I stepped closer. The vagrant story was still fresh in my mind. Picture this. Walking home one evening. A fresh smear of blood vaguely shaped like a footprint was visible on the gravel of this new road. Clearly this had been the way the stranger had taken. I stared ahead, now standing right at the start of the road. It seemed completely harmless. I could see the end just a few hundred steps in front of me. My deepest desire. And all it would take was to walk this short distance. I closed my eyes and raised my left foot. The world seemed to freeze. I was still standing there, ready to take a step forward. Just one little step, and then I'd just have to keep walking for a minute or so with my eyes closed. How hard could it be? And still my foot refused to move, refused to take this first step. The picture of that bloody footprint kept coming back to my mind. Being trapped on that road, walking and walking, through freezing nights and burning days, through hunger and thirst, always walking, until the legs go out and you crumble to the asphalt and you die, only to wake up from death and start walking again. My deepest desire just 60 seconds away. I couldn't do it. I opened my eyes. The road was gone. My foot was raised over the abyss. The world had changed back to how it should be. I was standing right at the edge of a cliff, my foot raised into empty air. Just one step and I'd end up as a shattered heap of bones down there. A sudden gust of wind shoved against my back as if urging me to take this step. A few stones crumbled beneath my weight, separated from the edge, and fall. I flung my arms around in panic, searching for something to hold on to. My foothold slipped, my knee buckled. I fell backward. My elbows painfully slammed against the ground. With panicked motions, I began crawling away from the edge, staring at the cliffside, at the place that, for a short minute, had been a road. And then it reappeared, literally in the blink of an eye. 1 second it was gone and my eyelids fluttered shut, and when I opened them again, there it was along with the surrounding forest, as if it had never been gone. I managed to scramble back to my feet. My heartbeat refused to calm down. I kept standing there, staring at the road while the sun slowly vanished behind the horizon. My deepest desire, just a quick little walk. Bloody footprint on the gravel. Finally, I ripped myself away, turned and began walking down the usual path. The path that I had walked thousands of times before. My deepest desire didn't come true that night, but I did get home. Mount St. Helens. The name is usually associated with a massive explosion that claimed the lives of more than 50 people and caused $1 billion in property damage. Now I think it should be known for something else. I was hiking the mountain with some friends of mine, Tom and Josh. Those two had been my best friends ever since elementary school. Tom was getting married in a week and insisted we get out camping. We were gonna hike up the side of the mountain and make camp for a few days. First night was great. We made camp, sat around a fire, drank and told stories just like old times. Josh was the first one to turn in, leaving me and Tom alone with the fire and booze. We chatted a bit more before he stood to head to bed. He asked if I was going to turn in, but I shook my head and told him I'd wait to make sure the fire went out. He ducked into his tent. As I sat there alone with my thoughts, then I noticed something. There was a pair of glowing red spots shining at me from the trees. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes. When I looked back up, they were gone. Had I imagined them? Maybe I'd had too much to drink, or maybe it was just an owl. Those spots were pretty high up, but they looked pretty big to belong to an owl. I sighed and kicked dirt over the embers of the fire and went into my tent. I crawled into my sleeping bag and started to doze off. Just before I did, though, I thought I heard something, like something rubbing against a tent. But by then it was too late and I drifted into a dreamless sleep. I woke to the smell of coffee and roasting sausages. I stepped out of the tent and saw Josh, always the early bird, was making a breakfast of coffee and sausage. I sat with him and enjoyed the crisp morning air and took in the scenery. I talked with Josh for a while before Tom woke up and joined us. We all sat together for a bit before we started packing our gear to go on a hike. While I noticed something weird. There seemed to be weird prints around the camp and tent. I wasn't really sure what they were. Then again, I wasn't an animal expert. But the weirdest part was that I didn't see any tracks leading to or from camp. They just circled the camp for a while before ending up abruptly near my tent. Maybe it had climbed a tree. It was possible, but there weren't many trees near the campsite. Before I had much more time to dwell on this, Tom called for me to join him and Josh. I shook my head to clear the thoughts and joined them. It was amazing. The forest had recovered beautifully from the disaster just 40 years prior. We took pictures and talked and laughed. It was perfect, until we came upon a body in a tree. Josh was the first to notice it. He was in the middle of making some joke about an athlete when he stopped and paled. I turned to see what froze him and felt the blood drain from my face. Suspended in the tree, 15 or 20 feet up, was a deer. Its body had been badly mangled. Its head held onto its body by a few strands of flesh. Its rear limbs were missing, and its stomach was ripped open with most of its entrails missing. Its body was stuffed in the crevice between two branches. Tom threw up at the sight, and none of us said anything. I think Josh broke the silence. He wanted to know what could have done something like that. I shook my head and told him that it could have been a cougar. I had heard that some big cats carried their kills up in trees. That didn't put him at ease. Tom explained that he had spoken to a park ranger before they came up here. They had said there weren't any large predators spotted near here. But even if it was a cougar, there wasn't much of a chance it'd bother us at camp. Plus he showed us a hunting rifle he had brought just in case. I suppose that was enough for Josh since he calmed a bit at that, and we resumed walking. Though this time we were silent. I didn't entirely think it was a cougar though. That body was pretty torn up and there were no claw marks on the trunk of the tree. But I didn't voice those concerns. By the time we made it back to camp, it had started getting dark, but the mood had lightened considerably. We were back to joking and laughing, the dead deer all but gone from our minds. But we fell silent once we saw the state of our camp. It had been totally ransacked. Our tents were ripped to shreds and our supplies were strewn all over the place. The coolers containing our food had been ripped open or totally crushed. I even saw that one looked like it had been flung 20 or 30 feet away. At first, I didn't see the beer cooler, until I looked up and saw it sitting between two branches 20 feet off the ground. Tom and Josh immediately began searching the remains of the camp for anything we could salvage. Both convinced that whatever had killed the deer had found our camp and ransacked it, and I agreed. While they searched for anything to salvage, I searched around for tracks. There were plenty large, clawed footprints around the camp that I had a hard time identifying, but the part that confused me was that, once again, none of the tracks were leading in or out of camp. I turned to point it out to the others, but I felt my voice die in my throat as my eyes fell on something in the trees. A massive shape with red eyes glaring at me. It stood in the darkness of the tree branches, at least 20 feet off the ground. I could just barely make out the shape of it. I could see a large, powerful body with muscular arms ending in claws that glinted in the rising moonlight. I saw a snout, almost like a wolf or bat, that was filled with sharp, yellowed teeth. I was about to yell out for one of the others when massive bat-like wings unfurled from behind the creature and launched it into the air and out of view with a single powerful flap. I quickly turned to the others, desperate to confirm if they saw what I saw, but was quickly silenced when Josh made a sound of triumph and held up the keys to the car. He explained that we could likely make a trip to a nearby ranger station and tell them what happened, then sort things out after that. He began making his way to the edge of camp, but only made it halfway when a massive dark shape dropped from the sky right on him and vanished upwards just as quickly, taking Josh with it. He didn't even have time to scream. Tom immediately began to panic, shouting, "What was that? What the hell was that?" While I searched the dark sky for any sign of Josh or whatever took him. There was no sign of either of them. Tom was still freaking out when I grabbed him by the shoulders and told him we had to get to the truck and try to get help. He still seemed to be in shock but numbly nodded and grabbed his rifle before we both made a mad dash through the woods. We ran as fast as we could, terrified we'd feel claws digging into our backs or shoulders with every step. However, I guess luck was on our side since we made it to the cars without anything happening. In fact, we were both running so fast we ended up nearly slamming into the car door. I immediately started yanking on the handle, desperately trying to open the door, when Tom's hand suddenly grabbed my shoulder. I turned to face him and saw he was pale and there were tears in his eyes.
I nearly came to tears myself when he reminded me that Josh had the keys. I don't know how long we stood there. An air of utter despair washing over both of us, before it was all shattered with a crash from behind me. I quickly turned to see Josh's mutilated body laying on the roof of the car. His eyes and most of his face had been clawed off. I opened my mouth to scream when suddenly I was nearly deafened by the sound of a gunshot from behind. When I turned around, I saw Tom aiming his gun at the sky, wildly firing at a dark shape above. If any of his shots made contact, that thing didn't show it. While he shot, I began desperately searching through Josh's pockets for the keys. I finally felt my fingers make contact with cold metal and pulled them out with a triumphant yell. I turned to tell Tom I had found the keys, but just as I did, I heard a sound that froze my blood. The click of an empty gun. Tom turned to me, a look of fear and despair in his eyes before he was tackled to the ground by that thing. I felt its wing hit me and I was knocked to the ground. The sound of Tom screaming and flesh tearing filled my ears as I saw the creature ripping into him. Instinct took over and I rolled under the truck. I closed my eyes and covered my ears, but the sound of Tom's screams still pierced into my mind. It felt like hours before they stopped, but it was likely only moments. When silence finally fell, I slowly opened one eye, terrified that the monster would be inches from my face. Instead, I saw the remains of Tom. His head was laying a few feet from his body with its empty, dead eyes staring at me. I strained my ears and eyes to catch any sign that that thing was still there, but I didn't see or hear anything. Part of me wanted to desperately climb out and try to get in the truck before it got me, but fear gripped my body and stopped me from moving. What if it was on the roof, or hovering just above the truck, waiting for me? I spent the entire night under that truck. Anytime I mustered the courage to try and crawl out, I thought I heard the beats of massive wings or something shifting on the roof of the car. Even when the sun came up, I was too afraid. The only thing that finally encouraged me to crawl out was the screech of tires. I looked up to see a park ranger vehicle near the truck. I quickly crawled out from under and staggered towards the ranger. What happened next was a blur. I remember desperately trying to explain what happened while the ranger looked at the bodies of my friends with a look of horror. I remember waiting at the station and trying to convince them that a massive, flying monster killed my friends. They didn't believe me. Of course, they also didn't believe I had killed my friends. According to them, no human could have done that to them. The attack was attributed to a bear that was seen in the area a few days later. Funerals were held for Tom and Josh. Most people were sympathetic and said they were happy I managed to make it out alive. Tom's fiancée didn't say a word to me. The look she gave me was enough. I attended therapy afterwards at the request of my family, and they said I was suffering from survivor's guilt, and that I made up the monster I saw out of terror. They're half right. I shouldn't have survived that night, but I didn't make up that monster. I know I didn't. I'm writing this in my car on the side of the road back on the mountain. My gun is in the seat next to me. I'm going back to the campsite, and this time, I'm not returning without that thing. No matter what. There's a rocking chair in the corner of my room. I take it out every night, but it returns every morning. It was my great-grandma's, then my grandma's, then my aunt, then my cousin, then my sister, and now mine. The tale of how it came into the family is an old one, told by my grandmother, until her death. The story goes as follows. My great-grandmother was walking down a path on a sunny afternoon. She came across two women dressed in white, and she stopped to watch them. They were carving out something from a tree. They paused and turned to my great-grandmother and asked her, "What is one item you'd like to have in your house?" My grandmother was taken aback by the question, but she nonetheless replied that she wanted a rocking chair. The two women dressed in white didn't reply to that, so my great-grandmother continued on her way. About a week or so later, the two women in white showed up to her house with a rocking chair. They told her 5 things before she took it. 1. The rocking chair must always belong to her. or a direct female descendant of her. 2. You must not fall asleep with a rocking chair in your room. Always move it to a different room. It might be in your room when you wake up. Just move it back out before you go to bed. 3. Don't allow anyone but current and past owners of the rocking chair to sit in it. 4. If you fall asleep with the rocking chair in your room, you need to surround it with a circle of salt. Pour a small amount of blessed water around it and leave until you go to bed. When you should move it out, pray that you manage to complete salt circle properly, or there is no saving you. 5. Once a year, a woman named Eliza will come to your door and ask you for a favor. You must say yes, no matter what she asks of you. If you say no, it'll make her angry. You won't like her when she's angry. Eliza may also request to stay with you. If she does, make sure the rocking chair is in her room. The women left after that. My grandmother told us this story every few months as children. Now, the honor is passed on to my aunt. The chair is mine now. I move it out every night without fail. I don't want to risk anything happening to me. I've only met Eliza 3 times. She was dressed in the latest fashion every time, but she spoke like a character from a Charles Dickens novel. Once, on a cold night, where she bought me the chair, she told me the first 4 rules and left. The second time I met Eliza, she was warmer towards me. She asked me to bring her a dead cat, which I must have killed myself. It pained me to end the cat, yeah, but it was better than facing Eliza's wrath. She was only a small woman, looking like she was maybe in her early 20s, but she felt older than that. She had green eyes that looked old and weathered, as if she'd seen many things and taken them in stride. The third time was more recent. She asked to stay with me for a while. She had many strange requests this time, such as bringing her apples that had been soaked in wine, and the blood of 7 ravens. I complied. I remembered to put the rocking chair in her room each night. She stayed for 4 days. In the night, I'd hear children singing, but I pretended I couldn't hear it. I made sure to act sad when she left, but inside I was relieved. I've only broken the 3rd rule once, when a friend of mine sat down in it. She screamed as if she'd been burnt, and stood back up. About a month later, she committed suicide. I don't know if sitting in the chair and her death were related, but I've always had a feeling they were. As for the next person, to keep the chair when I can no longer, I believe it'll be my niece. She is one of the people who it could be passed on to, and I believe that she will be able to cope with it. She's smart. She'll be fine.